So please help me welcome Professor Jolyon Mitchell.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for coming out this evening. I'm really looking forward to exploring this topic with you of peace building through the visual arts. And I'd like to begin by looking at one of the best known and well-respected artists from Germany in the 20th century, Käthe Kollwitz. And starting with this picture, which was one of 6, reflecting on something that happened earlier in the 19th century. And it's focusing on a particular group of weavers in Berlin who was protesting against unfortunate rights. They had very few rights, but just focus very closely on the mother and son, because that's what I'd like to think about when we think about Käthe and her work as an artist. Because she had 2 sons, one called Hans and the other called Peter. In 1914, Peter came to his mum and asked her and said, please, I'd really like to serve the country. And after some persuading, she agreed to go and speak to Karl, the father, and they agreed, against their will, but feeling it was a legitimate cause at that stage, to fight. Within a few weeks, Peter had died and was killed on the front. And this is his memorial. And over the next 18 years, the same number of years that he lived, she attempted to try and artistically respond to his tragic death. And I want to look with you at how her work, particularly in response to her own grief, began to bear witness. So that's the first idea, to think about how visual art can bear witness. Firstly, to grief. You can see it. She did probably over 30, probably many more actual self-portraits. And you can see the impact that it had upon her life. This is her in 1912, and this is her in 1915, a year after Peter had died. And you can see, if you look closely at her eyes, understandably she'd been crying for many weeks and months. This is what she wrote in her diary. That point in time marked the beginning of old age, my walking towards my grave. That was a rupture, a bending down so low that I will never be able to stand straight. And she talked about how her life up to 1914 was happy, and then after that, there was this heartbreak and sadness that affected the rest of her life. In 1903, she had a premonition that perhaps Peter would die, and this is a mother with dead child. And she talked to her other son, Hans, that as she painted this, as she etched this, she wept because she imagined that might be a possibility. And this is how she responded after the war in a letter to a friend. I've tried again and again to represent war. I was never able to capture it. Now, finally, I have finished a series of woodcuts that come close to expressing what I have already wanted to express. And over a period of about 5 years, she struggled with which materials to use. Should she use lithographs or should she use etchings? But she finally settled on using woodcuts. And she produced 7, and I'm going to take you through a number of them. This is the second one, and you can see it's called The Volunteers. Have a look there, and you can see it's a bit like a danse macabre, isn't it? Can you spot that there's a skull at the front representing death, and next to death, that's a representation of Peter, and then a number of his friends who were killed in the First World War. Some are looking forward to the fight, others are in desolation and fear. This is Parents, the third woodcut in the war series, the Krieg series. And you can see here how it's almost as if they are holding each other and not able to look at each other. They've almost come one form. Like poets, she attempted again and again to get it right. So you can see, if we track her work before, have a look here, you can see actually this was an earlier attempt that she thought wasn't quite right because the grief had separated the parents. This is how she finalized it in 1921-22. And then in the fourth sheet, the fourth woodcut, you can see here the widow, one of 2 pictures of widows. And you can see there's obviously no husband here, but the widow is holding a baby inside her. This was earlier attempts. First, you can see here, this was a line etching of the widow. She rejected it. And then also you can maybe just see Widow 1. This was another rejected version, but this is a crayon lithograph. So she was trying to find the way of visually expressing her grief, but also how that was expressed around the country at that time. That's where she finished. And then this picture, the mothers. This was the 6th sheet in the war series. You can see almost it's like some art critics call this it's like a fortress of people being brought together in grief. And can you see the child just peeking out? They're trying to protect from this moment of grief together. This was an earlier attempt which she rejected, but you can see here the children are more explicit. So this is, again, what she landed with in 1921-22. And then finally, the final sheet in the war series, the people. And here, this is a quotation, of course, of many pieces of art from, who's it from? It's from Mary, Mother of Mercy here. It's a sort of a visual quotation. And you can see here, can you just make out beneath Mary, can you see a little child that she's trying to protect at that moment in the midst of grief and in silence? And one art critic has said that her silent lines penetrate the marrow like a cry of pain. Now, these were just 7 prints after 4 years of war, but this was her response. To begin with, in the war, she felt that it was a legitimate act. But then, as the war went on after the death of her son, she became a pacifist. And this is what she wrote to a friend after it was concluded. These prints should be sent all over the world and give everybody the essence of what it was like. This is what we all went through during these unspeakably hard times. And have a look at this as perhaps one of her best-known pieces, No More War, this poster which was used up to the 1980s in anti-war movements. But it's this that stayed with me, thinking about this, how it took 18 years to try and capture a response to the death of their son. This is where he's buried now, in Belgium, in a German war cemetery. And Peter is not alone. He's with hundreds, thousands of young men. And you can see here the grief separates. It's not bringing them together, but it separates the parents. This statue is called The Grieving Parents. Now, this is one example from one war. We could select many examples of bearing witness to grief that artists use. For example, this is from the Iran-Iraq War by an Iranian artist. It's called The Scent of Heaven. Some people have said, no, it's more like the scent of grief because they're smelling the loss of a loved one. So here is one example of, through the work of Kollwitz, of visual art bearing witness to grief. But visual arts can also bear witness in a different way to the pity of war. And you perhaps know this piece, this Otto Dix piece, from a war triptych. But this famous one, there's an absence of life. And this, of course, is a quotation of what? Of the Sistine Chapel, of the creation of Adam. But there's perhaps no Adam or no God in this desolate space. And this is Paul Nash's response to what he saw. He was furious by what he saw as a commissioned artist. He was an eyewitness of what would happen. His art tutor said to him, "You're no good at painting faces." So you can see the inscriptions is in the land. Notice here the scar is on the land. And you can have a look at the trees here, almost sort of human forms here. This is from a BBC documentary on the work of Paul Nash.
From July 1917 to the end of the war, Nash would obsessively depict the landscapes of battle and their detritus. Churned up trenches, shattered artillery, broken down vehicles. The Menin Road, a scarred and pitted world. Rubble and wire, dead trees, stagnant pools of oily water, furtive soldiers scurrying, nowhere to hide. The painter's style has suddenly changed. The forms are more isolated. The fairy tale mood of his earlier work has been bombed out of him. It's oil on canvas, not pen on paper, and it's monumental, 6 feet across, the scale of history painting. It was an official commission, and the Ministry of Information encouraged Nash to look to a famous Renaissance battle painting by Paolo Uccello. But comparison shows just how subversive the Menin Road is. Uccello shows war as heroic chivalry, men jousting. Nash shows us what war looks like when chivalry's been gassed and mortared. Turns Uccello's lances into fractured tree stumps, Uccello's noble corpses into tumbled breeze blocks and scraps of metal. In modern war, you can't even find the bodies. And as for Uccello's pastoral battlescape, it's become a wasteland, a place of terror, where even the sky looks torn or incinerated.
Paul's Nash has been quoted by contemporary artists from the 20th century and 21st century, such as this French artist who did this landscape or warscape as a piece of art from Iraq, responding to what had happened in the Iraq wars. Of course, other artists attempt to respond to war, to the pity of war, to bear witness to it in different ways. For example, this official artist, William Orpen, this is the signing of the peace in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. Now, William Orpen was so cross, he was so angry with the political leaders at that time, that notice how they are dwarfed by the mirrors. See how the mirrors almost distort the whole picture there, as you're looking down upon these different leaders from the victorious nations at Versailles. Visual art can not only bear witness to grief, not only to the pity of war, but also, quite simply, to evil. Yesterday, here in this room, there was a fabulous lecture by Anthony Penrose. Anthony Penrose is the son of Lee Miller, and he gave an insightful, provocative, indelible, unforgettable lecture on the work of his mother. And it should be coming up on the Gresham website soon. But it's another example, not just of bearing witness, but of bearing witness to evil, because she visited, I think, 4 concentration camps. I want to talk about my own experience, which was visiting not concentration camps, but a country in Central Africa, in Rwanda, quite soon after a genocide that claimed about 800,000 lives. And there's one place that I went to that changed how I thought what I should be doing as an academic. And it was this place just outside Kigali, about a couple of hours outside. We had to drive down a mud track eventually to get there. And it was what was a church, but is now known as a killing church, because in this place, Natarama, something like 6,000 women, men, children lost their lives during this genocide over a period of 2 or 3 days. And to go in there, to go into the space, the first thing that struck me was the smell of rotting fabric. It had actually been left for a number of months with the bodies there, but then it was, inverted commas, tidied up. You can see here, and you can maybe just make out how it's been tidied up. The picture on the wall is of John Paul I, because this was supposedly one of the most Catholic Christian countries in Africa. And yet the places of safe haven were no longer that, because they became places of killing. In fact, the time that I first encountered what had happened in Rwanda in 1994 was not in Rwanda itself, but here in the Cambridge University Library. And I remember sitting at one of the desks there in a comfortable, warm space, reading first-hand accounts that had just come from Rwanda of what had happened, and having to stop feeling sick by what I was reading and looking out the window. And all I could hear were children playing football or rugby and someone cutting the grass. And I thought I could get on a plane and I could be in a place where this had just happened. And indeed, that's what I did for work, to work as a researcher and also as a journalist there. And I remember visiting, this is not like the Vietnam War Memorial with lots of names, but also blank spaces. And the reason there are blank spaces there is because there are, it wasn't just one person in the family, but the whole family that was eradicated. And the guide who showed us around, she had lost her parents and her siblings. And she said something I'll never forget, which was quite simply, make sure you tell people what happened here so it never happens again, never again. So here artists can be bearing witness to evil. And I want to look at some examples, 2 examples of artists who attempted to bear witness through their art. This is Alfredo Jar's piece, The Eyes of Gutateta Emerita. And she was one of about 3 or 4 people who hid. She was in Natarama. She hid in the marshes for many weeks and survived with her daughter. And he, with her permission, took photo of her eyes and then replicated that over 800,000 times and created this as a memorial to some of the people killed in the genocide. He also, through his art, questioned how the West had covered some of the story. The fact that the genocide had been going on, and yet things such as Kurt Cobain's suicide, the election in South Africa in 1994, the trial of O.J. Simpson had dominated the front covers of places like Newsweek. And so he, through his exhibition, said, well, he raised a question, the art of questioning, why was it that this story was left out? We can maybe talk about that later. And this is a piece by a British artist, a friend called Paul Hobbs, sometimes known as Fear Action. And you can see here he's an emergency break glass because many of the people killed in the genocide in Rwanda were killed by farming implements. He says this is both a memorial to the tragic bloodletting in Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and recently Kenya, and an expression of what fear can drive us to do. So this art here can be bearing witness and also being a memorial. This is outside a school where hundreds, thousands of pupils and staff were killed during the genocide. And in French, the translation is, you cannot respond to such a determined, terrible crime except with an equal determination to bear witness. Now, you may feel that sometimes a response to this, that art, even art is not adequate to response. Maybe, and you'll notice this is a blank slide, maybe the appropriate response is silence for a while. But I want to juxtapose that with the people that we met at this killing church, because it's quite easy to define a place by a tragedy that's happened, a killing that's happened, and yet Rwanda in many ways is a very hopeful country. It's a dynamic country, a positive country that has many peace projects that have involved trying to bring together different groups, the Hutu and Tutsi groups. So the art is in some ways also representing more hopeful futures, which we'll be looking at later. So that's art that bears witness. What I'd like to now move on is think about how art can transform violence. This is something I've spent some time thinking about, but I think it can be an ambivalent gift. Firstly, it can be something which is celebrating violence as something which can be celebrated, something that's fabulous. This is in the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow. And as you perhaps know, in Moscow, the patron saint is St. George. And St. George is sometimes used now to symbolize what Russia is doing towards Ukraine or towards the West, because it's that we're conquering the dragon of the West. Of course, even in Russia, there's critiques of this approach. You can see, for example, this, which is maybe putting a question mark over, is this the right use of our patron saint? If you go to the Peace Guard in the United Nations, you can see things like a gun turned into, it's not firing, but it's been sort of mangled into a non-gun. But there is this, which I've spent a long time looking at, this piece by a Soviet artist called Swords into Plowshares. But this is very much peace brought through strength. How do you bring peace? You bring it perhaps through violence. This was a gift to the United Nations in the Cold War. So have a think about that. It's saying, isn't it, that really to bring peace, you need to use strength. If you travel, and you can find this piece in a museum just outside Moscow as well, where they have some of the old Soviet sculptures. If you travel about an hour outside Moscow, you can go to the main cathedral of the Russian armed forces. And there you can hear regularly Patriarch Kirill or a number of other patriarch leaders celebrating Ruski Mir, this idea that there is one blood, one soil, one nation. And you'll hear it in their sermons and their pronouncements in the church. There's a common faith, a common language, a common czar, a common church in Belarus, in Russia, and Ukraine. And we need to work together to bring them together and sacrifice ourselves. If you go inside the cathedral, you can see here the saints on the ground. Often there are military figures within the cathedral, but you'll notice how they're connected with the saints on the walls, on the murals and the icons around the church. Look up at the church and you'll see historic people who've been involved in former wars, but also in the Great Patriotic War. You'll see some of the former generals from the 1940s. And this is a genuine, I try not to overuse the word, it's extraordinary because you have a look at this church, you see generals, but you also see, can you spot here, there's Stalin. Stalin, of course, who was responsible for the death of many nuns, bishops, and many religious leaders during his time in charge of Russia. And yet there he is on the wall of this cathedral. So this, if you can see, the art here is showing how you can bring peace through violence. So transforming art, but in a perhaps negative way. Now I want you to bear this in mind, bear that sort of strong image of peace, this. If you wore this little thing, this little badge, this fragile badge, in Germany in the 1980s, you could lose your place in university, you could lose your flat, you could lose your job, because it was a protest against the militarization of education in universities, because students said, we don't want that. We're not prepared to be that way. So think about those two ways of thinking about how you bring peace and how you represent that artistically, the fragile badge or the strong statue. This leads towards, we'll be going to from Moscow to Mozambique, but before we do that, I'd like you to take you to a stage in Chester. And this is a piece of theatre I will never, ever forget. Because what happened was, you have the Coventry Carol in the background, that beautiful haunting carol. You have these women holding babies, and then you have young child soldiers walking up to these women and touching them on the shoulder. And what happened was, they let go of the babies. And instead of the babies turning into babies on the floor, they turned into flags of countries where there had been child soldiers. And one of the countries was Mozambique, this country that had a civil war that claimed something like 1 million lives, a complicated civil war. At the end of the war, there were something like 6 million weapons that were stored underground, hid away, and this was a real problem because what do we do with these weapons? You perhaps know this story, but it's something I find deeply hopeful.
During years of war, Mozambique was flooded with guns from all over the world. The country is now at peace, and the guns are being cut up and made into art.
Que a árvore da vida é mesmo para dar esperança e dar mais vida.
This is the story of how weapons of war have been made into a symbol of peace. Mozambique is a former Portuguese colony in southern Africa. Following the end of the Civil War, artists have been making sculptures out of guns, the same guns that killed over 1 million people during years of conflict in the country. Now, at least some of the guns are being sent back to where they were made in the form of art, to the UK and the British Museum in London.
Perhaps you've been to the African Gallery and seen the Tree of Life. But this emerged really because this guy, this bishop, was at a peace conference and he could not sleep because he kept imagining all the guns that were left from the Civil War. Even though there was peace, people were holding on to guns just in case they needed them. And he thought they were like snakes in the house. And then he started thinking about this text from Micah and Isaiah of swords into plowshares. And he developed this idea with Christian Aid and with other charities in Mozambique to transform guns into plowshares so you can cultivate your land and get your daily bread. Let's see how it worked.
Bring your gun and we will exchange it with an instrument of production.
Deux armes matrices, já deu que chapa, esse caso já veio aqui, chada também.
The way that the project works, we go to the village and they take us to the place where the weapons are.
We have been able to collect more than 500,000 guns. The way to deal with a gun is to cut it in small pieces, neutralize it. Artists took the pieces of these guns and made them into works of art. It was amazing. They came with very creative initiatives. And now we have the Tree of Life.
Really grateful to the British Museum for letting us use that, and also to Christian Aid for the earlier piece of film. So again, I don't use guns anymore just to hoe on my land. So imagine you're a village, you've got lots of guns, you take the guns in, you get a tractor. Some people would give guns, they would get a hoe. Children would bring bullets and they would get pencils back. And then they would be turned into pieces of art, such as this famous throne of weapons. You perhaps Neil McGregor's 100 objects that tell the story of the world. This was number 98, if I think I remember, but it tells the story of the Civil War, because these were all weapons made outside Mozambique. This is the artist Käthe. They went on a tour around the country, into prisons, into schools, into shopping centres, into Coventry Cathedral, where it was used. In one prisoner said this: the most powerful thing you can do is pick up a book, not a gun, when he saw this exhibition. The Tree of Life was similarly made out of weapons, constructed outside Mozambique. This is a gratuitous picture, but I can't resist putting up. In Mozambique, there were floods, and this young girl is back in a tree. The reason she's there is because her mother was there stuck. She was stuck in the tree, and there was flood water all around her. They tried to helicopter her out, but she couldn't because she was giving birth. And this is the baby who 10 years later was brought literally to life on a tree with floodwaters around. So there are different kinds of trees of life in Mozambique. This is where it was in Mozambique Peace Park. It was commissioned by the British Museum, and that's why it's there now. You can see it. Now, I want you to imagine that this whole experience of swords into plowshares is like a stone dropping into a pond, because what happened was it spread out, and other artists copied this. So, for example, in Cambodia, weapons were turned into art. In Iraq, and also in the States, there was a gun amnesty in New York where people were handed in guns, they were smelted down and turned into different objects. For example, this is a bike rack in San Francisco, or this Angel of Peace following all these guns handed in New York, which was taken to Ground Zero. In Sunderland, this was copied more recently, you perhaps know about this, where people handed in knives and turned into this massive angel, which was placed in the centre of the town. In Edinburgh, this church got it completely wrong, because they had an amnesty for toys, for military toys, and everyone gave their toys in, and it was turned into a crib. But they forgot to do the exchange. So the children, the youngsters, wanted their toys back because they hadn't received anything in exchange. So the toys were returned after Christmas. So it's interesting, the economics of peace building as well. So that's art that transforms violence. And then finally, I want to think with you about art that imagines not violence, but hopeful futures. Can you guess which artistic response this is to? Which piece of violence? This is the Charlie Hebdo killings, and this was by a cartoonist who simply responded by saying, yesterday we were working, today we lost many of our colleagues who were drawing pictures and cartoons, but tomorrow we will go on working. So here, art that imagines hopeful futures. People often talk about building peace, but I also like thinking about growing peace. In the States, there's this project, you perhaps know it in Richmond, whenever anyone is shot, people give, they create mud packs, but for 1 year they created not mud packs, but earth packs of guns. Now that you might think is a bit depressing, but they planted in these guns tiny little seeds. And so what happened was that little seeds sprung out of the guns, and then finally, here, do you see the gun was transformed into something very different. And then, of course, there are walls that we imagine the end of walls. This is supposedly a Banksy picture. We could look at lots of Banksy pieces, but this is one piece. The story, whether it's true or not, is that Banksy was painting this, a view to a piece or another piece of art, on the dividing wall in Israel-Palestine. And a Palestinian came up to him and said, please do not paint on this wall. Why? Because it's making something ugly beautiful. Well, think about that as we watch this next piece.
A wall represents a failure of politics. You can't love your neighbour if you can't see them, if you can't talk to them. A lady who brings down walls is probably my most famous work. By putting an icon, something of incredible beauty, onto something which is itself so ugly, it's a way to challenge it and to break it. It's invoking the powers of heaven, the powers of reconciliation, the powers of love, into a chasm of despair and hopelessness. A lot of people just don't understand and feel frustrated at the inhumanity that they see, and they don't know what to do. So they come to this image and pray, and they just pray that somehow all these walls that people have built can crumble, can fade away, and something beautiful can be reborn. Bethlehem is the town of birth, of rebirth. And here it's the wall just positioned on the edge of Bethlehem and the edge of Jerusalem. So it's this sort of transition point where you've got all this despair, but then also this hope breaking through.
I have a friend who lives in Bethlehem, and she says that place is not just a place of prayer, but it's a place of meeting of different groups, Palestinians, Israelis, Jews, Muslims, Christians meet there. Sometimes they're silent there, sometimes they simply meet and pray there. Sometimes it's a place of protest, a place also of dialogue as well. So we're heading towards the end of this lecture. We've looked at how they can imagine hopeful futures, and of course there are different ways in which art can do that. And we can see sometimes it's a singular act of strength. Sometimes it may be that art represents how sometimes war, conflict, hurt, grief divides us, separates us. It can take us apart from each other. But other times it can, of course, bring people together. This is by Josephina, an artist called Josephina, and she I think it's in 5 different places. It's in Coventry, it's in Bradford, it's in Hiroshima, it's in Belfast, and this is in Berlin, sometimes known as the death zone as well. And the artist based it on a story of a husband and wife who were separated by the war and traveled across Europe to be reunited. But she turned it into something which she thought has global significance, and it's sometimes known as, quite simply, as reconciliation. Now, of course, you might say, yeah, but this all sounds a bit idealistic. Surely we can't drop pieces of art into conflict zones. Really, will origami really solve things what are happening in Gaza or in eastern Ukraine? Well, not necessarily. But I find this picture, this sculpture, Hands Across the Divide in Derry, Londonderry, something which I think expresses well the act of growing peace, of building peace, of hands across the divide. They're not yet united, but they're reaching out towards the other side. And there's something which is deeply hopeful about that, but also quite realistic about how art can sometimes be used, visual art can be used so well and effectively, but also to represent the struggle of building peace. I have a friend who does a lot of peace building at sort of mid-range, i.e. not sort of the presidents and top generals, but perhaps the mayors and religious leaders. And he often describes how in peace-building situations where there are blockages, what he'll bring into the conflict situation is a poet and an artist. And the poet will read some local poetry and the artist will paint in response to the conflict. And sometimes, he says, that changes the way people think about the conflict. So, yes, it can sometimes not work, but in other contexts, it can work. So bear those three different models in mind of art that represents separation, reconciliation, but also reaching towards the other. So that's what I mean by art that imagines hopeful futures. But by way of conclusion, I'd like to return to some of the images we saw at the beginning, or at least just bring them back to mind, with a picture here. This is in Edinburgh Botanic Gardens, where I lived for many years. Well, I didn't live in the botanics, I lived quite close to it. And you can see here this frame. But what I like about this frame is that it's empty, and it represents, doesn't it, that if you're sitting on one side of the frame, you'll get a different view. You might see Arthur's Seat. If you're sitting on the other side, you might see the castle. And that, of course, represents how frames don't just draw our attention and don't just exclude things. They also include things, but we bring our own frames of reference. So perhaps we were born in Haifa in a Jewish family who lost their relatives in the Shoah, in the Holocaust, or we were born in Hebron, a Palestinian. Our frame of reference will be different, and therefore we will look at a conflict differently. Art at its best can help us think about our own frames of reference, but also encourage us to empathize, to look into the other's world and to imagine what is it like to be the other person sitting in a conflict situation. Of course, art here, and the very deeply ironic title, We Are Making a New World. Well, we are making a new world when we look at that. But look at the tree as the human form. But then here, the tree of grief. This was a response, an artistic response to the terrorist attack in Beslan, which claimed something like over 1,000 people in an attack on a school. Hundreds of children were killed. And you can see here, can you make out here, these are mothers lifting their dead children to heaven, pushing them up as if they had become angels. So a tree of grief. We've looked at how art can bear witness to grief. We've looked at this tree of life. It's a very hopeful tree because, of course, it's showing how weapons don't have to be used to kill. They can be used to actually represent life, that provides trees, that provide shade, and a place that people can be brought to life in. Or here, this tree of hope. This is just outside the Old City in Jerusalem by Mark Koreth. And can you just have a look at the leaves? The leaves are not leaves. What are they? They're swallows. And talking to both a Palestinian and an Israeli ornithologist, he said, the great thing about birds here, swallows or doves, is they're not constricted by the barriers but the walls. So this is such a hopeful piece of art, because it's saying there is a time that perhaps the walls will come down just as they did in 1989. So to finish, this last picture, and I was talking to a colleague who works here from Ukraine, and we were talking about this artist, no longer with us, but a Ukrainian artist. A dove has spread her wings and asks for peace. In the beginning of the war a few years ago, in 2022, one of the early places that were hit was a museum that held many of her pieces of art. Some were destroyed, but the villagers in that town were so keen to preserve it. At least one man, I think several, actually dashed into the flames and dragged out and rescued the pieces of art. So precious did they recognize them, not just as cultural entities, identity statements, but also of saying, these are the language, the vision of hope, that even in a conflict that seems so intractable, whether in Israel-Palestine or Russia-Ukraine, there's hope, and that the idea that a dove of peace can spread her wings and asks and hopes for peace. Thank you so much for listening.